Hello everybody, this is Professor Ramirez and I would like to talk about the Maqama. I'm basing this lecture on a book by W.J. Prendergast, which is called The Maqama of Badi al-Zaman al-Hamadani. So Prendergast translated al-Hamadani's work. What he also did was he explained what the Maqama is. It's an Arabic rhymed prose literary form with short poetic passages. So what that means is that it's a combination of prose and poetry. The Maqama is from a root which means he stood, and in this case it means to stand in a literary discussion in order to orate. There are basically two classical exponents of the Maqama. One of them is Hamadani. He was born in 967 and he passed away fairly early in 1007. He's the composer of about 50 Maqama that we have available to us. He may have written even a few hundred more than that. And one of his successors, I suppose, is named Hariri. We don't really need to know about Hariri, just that the Maqama was an important literary form, and there were many creators, writers, poets who were contributing to this new genre. So Hamadani was born in basically what is now Iran, and he spent his life as a wandering scholar. The Maqama of Hamadani and his counterpart have a similar structure. They both consist of a series of unrelated episodes involving a wandering narrator, and there's also a trickster protagonist or a trickster figure. In the Maqama of Hamadani, the narrator is often an alter ego of Hamadani, and what I mean, or what Prendergast means by this, is that the Maqama can be a self-reflective work where the author makes reference to the act of writing or the act of creation or the act of conceiving of poetry. And in the Maqama of Hamadani, the narrator may be called Abul Fath al-Iskandari. So you want to pay attention to that name, al-Iskandari. It's worth writing down. Iskandari wanders the earth, surviving on his wits and a silver tongue. He runs scams. He's always one step ahead of an angry mob. Each story is a small capsule description of a sometimes absurd predicament that the characters find themselves in. Nonetheless, the stories are often used as framing for discourses on serious topics, such as predestination, the vanity of human life, and the inevitability of death and judgment. So the Maqama, as we see in this collection, presents a vivid street-level view of the medieval Islamic countries at the height of their power and culture. So we want to be mindful that al-Hamadani was writing when Islam was fairly new. And he had a challenge because the faith frowned upon the representation of reality and the representation of the human form. So the appearance of the Maqama is something that challenges that faith. At the same time, it's going to incorporate wisdom and sayings from the Quran. So in the Maqama, so there's a series of Maqama, there's more than one. We meet merchants, clerics, peasants, sultans, scholars, an entire catalog of swindlers. We get to see all different kinds of cities all over the Mediterranean, Iraq, and Middle East, Iraq, Iran, Arabia, Yemen, and we may even recognize some of these cities today, Baghdad, for example, Basra. So I want you to understand that what you're reading, one of which is the Maqama of Poesy, it comes from about 50 other Maqama. And they're all, as you can see, they're all on different kinds of topics. So it could be about the date. It could be about a city, Baghdad or Basra. It could be about the blind. They're all different kinds of topics. Okay, the next thing that we want to know is a little bit about Al-Hamdani, he seems to have an ambivalence about his origins, and it's quite amazing that he has the education that he does have. But he sort of looks with derision upon his roots, and he's compelled to go out into the world and meet other storytellers, meet merchants, meet sultans, warriors, and he's gathering experience and he's gathering insight as he goes. What are the Maqama about? I had mentioned that they could be about wine, the Maqama of wine. They could be Maqama of the lion. They could be based on cities. They could also be traditions of the prophets, so that would be Muhammad, jurisprudence, legendary lore concerning the pagan times of the Arabs, so this would be before Muhammad, before Islam, battle. It could be recitations, philosophy, philology, poetics, grammar, the art of writing. And again, travel. So travel is something that it's a tissue, it's a web, it's a theme that connects the Maqama with other stories that we're reading. So we know that in the age of 22, Al-Hamdani left his native place in Iran, and he proceeded to the court of the Sahib. So this is significant because he had access to a library. He had access to very important people. And so this was going to allow him to develop his ideas, to engage in conversation, and to have some life of privilege. Then, which I find very interesting, he went to the Jurjan, where he frequented the Society of Heretics. And I just find that interesting because it means that he was thinking outside the confines of his own faith, thinking outside of, the precepts of Islam. He lived till about 40, and he had rather an uncomfortable and disastrous demise. He had been ill and possibly poisoned, and so he was buried, or entombed, I should say, not buried, but he was entombed rather prematurely, and he woke up entombed, still alive, but then it was too late to rescue him, and he did finally, die again. He also had a daughter that he cared for very much, and he also took an interest in his nephew, and his advice to his sister's son manifests a commendable concern for the boy's education. He says, "Thou art my son, as long as learning is thy business, the school thy place, the ink flask thy ally, and a book thy friend." And I really love that remark and that advice and that passage, because it's sort of a recipe for living. That we have the learning as our business, the school is our place, the ink flask is our ally, and a book our friend. These are the tools for living on our journey through life. So the next thing that we want to know is that we're losing a bit in the translation. The original Maqama would have been written in rhyme, and each sentence would have been crafted according to this notion of parallelism. So we're not going to necessarily see that in the translation, but it's good to just be mindful of it. We also want to be aware that the Maqama include references to obscure sayings, and then also to popular sayings that might have come from the Quran. And so it's really, it's a mirror of its time. Okay, so the next thing that I want to do, having introduced the Maqama generally and the life of Al-Hamdani, is I want to turn to the Maqama of poesy. And with any work of literature, we really want to begin with the title. And so the Maqama of poesy, we can tell it's going to be about the act of creation. It's going to be some kind of imparting of some universal truth. And it begins with Isa ibn Hisham related to us and said, and I'm just going to start to focus on that first phrase, because Hisham is a figure who pops up throughout the Maqama, and it's a way of launching the story. And Hisham will come and close the Maqama as well. So the Maqama often has this kind of circular structure. It will begin with a narrator, and then it will conclude with the same narrator. And so here's what Hisham says. Separation once hurled me hither and thither until I reached the utmost confines of Jurjan. Here to fortify myself against the days, I took some arable land, which I proceeded to cultivate. I invested in some goods as my stock in trade, settled upon a shop as my place of business, and selected some friends whom I made my companions. And so when he's at his shop, when Hisham is at his shop, he's conversing with his friends, and they're talking about poetry. And there was sitting but a short distance off a youth listening, as if he understood the conversation. And what we have here is the idea of the insider and the outsider. So Hisham and his friends are the insiders. They're a group, a coterie, and then the youth is sort of this outsider who's listening attentively but waiting for the opportunity to come in. And he says, this youth, ye have found the little palm tree loaded with fruit. And so this is an example of how Al-Hamadani has this rich imagery where the palm tree loaded with fruit is sort of like a gift of knowledge. And so I said, O learned one, come near. And what we have in this moment is an opposition between youth and age, or inexperience and experience. And Al-Hamadani is upsetting that idea, because in this youth is great wisdom. And indeed it says, speak, for thou hast cut thy wisdom tooth. He then approached, meaning the youth, question me and I will answer you. Listen and I will delight you. So the youth is taking on this role of performer. And what we want to understand about this period and this time was that the poets engaged in these healthy debates with each other, and they were going to see who is the master of language and wit. And so Hisham is asking him, well, what do you think about Najiga? And he keeps asking about different poets and writers, or what do you think about Zuhair? And so you don't have to attend so much to each individual creator or figure. The main idea that you want to get from the scene is that they were there's a rivalry, there's this rich renaissance taking place where this literature is coming into being. What does thou say to Tarafa? And we're also reflecting on these poets and these writers who were perhaps taken away, before their time. Okay, so then this Maqama is quite concise, and it's going to resolve, or it's going to conclude with the youth's own poetry. He says, do you not see I am wearing a threadbare cloak, borne along in misfortune by a bitter lot, cherishing hatred for the nights from which I meet with red ruin. My utmost hope is for the rising of Sirius. But long have we been tormented by vain hopes. Now this noble personage was of higher degree, and his honor was of greater price. For my enjoyment I pitched my green tents in the mansion of Dara, and in the hall of Kisra. But fortune reversed my circumstances, and pleasure, my familiar friend, became a stranger to me. Of my wealth naught remained but a memory, and so on today. But for the old dame at Suramanra and the babes on this side of the hills of Basra, upon whom fate has brought affliction, I would, O masters, destroy myself deliberately. So here the youth is reflecting on his past, and Hisham says, oh, but I think I recognize you. Aren't you Al-Iskandari? So there's this kind of play with identity. And the youth says, Surah, the times are false. Let not deception beguile thee. Cleave not to one character, but as the nights change, do thou change to. Meaning, don't look too closely into what you think you see. Instead, roll with the current of life.